Hello and welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new. Thank you for joining me today. This video is a request from a viewer who was having some trouble keeping the edges of their crochet projects straight. So in this video, I'm going to cover the things that cause our edges to be uneven, how to fix those things, and then I'm also going to give you some alternatives to turning chains, because I find that not using turning chains always keeps my edges straighter. So I'm gonna go over those things for you. So if this sounds interesting to you, then let's dive in. When it comes to the edges of our projects not being straight, one of two things are likely the issue. Number one, we're either picking up or dropping stitches. So we're either adding in or subtracting stitches. And two, it's just the simple use of turning chains. Because what happens, as you can look at my little swatches here, on these two, I didn't use turning chains. And on these two, I did. And the thing about turning chains, because the chain will always look different from the actual stitches. And it'll always leave a gap, because when you use a turning chain, you don't work into the first stitch. So you're always going to have a little gap between where the turning chain is and where your next stitch will be placed. So just that will end up having your edges just not looking the exact same way as the body of the project, especially if you're working with closed stitches. When it comes to open stitches, most time you won't notice. So if you're working like filet or some kind of lace, if you're using turning chains, a lot of the times you won't notice. The edges will still be okay because there's a lot of space in between your stitches. But when it comes to creating a solid fabric, when you use turning chains, you're always going to have these little holes on the edges of the project versus not using the turning chains. So I'm going to grab a little swatch here and I'm going to show you. So on this one, I have missed and added a couple stitches throughout this little swatch. So on my first row here, I started with 16 stitches, I think. And then on the next row, what happens, and this is always likely where you're gonna miss your first stitch. So after you work your first row and then you come across to work your row 2, a lot of times we will miss working into the turning chain from the first row. So that's always something to look out for if you are using turning chains. And then I work that row, and then on this row here, what happens also sometimes is when you're using turning chains, you will forget to skip the first stitch. So you'll chain 3 and then you'll work into the same stitch that is connected to the turning chain. But when you're working turning chains, you don't work into this first stitch. So on this row here, I ended up adding a stitch. On the following row, I went ahead, I chained 3, I didn't work into that first stitch, and I worked the stitch as I normally would. And I did the same on this row, but what can also happen sometimes too, and this will get missed a lot, and it's a lot harder to find. We will sometimes miss stitches in the middle of our work, like you'll jump a stitch. This happens to me quite often too, especially if I'm working projects where one row is solid and then another one has like a chain space. I will, once I'm working into the row that has the chains, I'll sometimes miss a stitch. And it's easy, whether you're working a solid fabric or a lace fabric, it's easy to miss stitches. So this is also something to look out for if you're finding that your edges aren't quite even. A lot of times it's adding or subtracting stitches. That is most likely the problem. And for this, what we will always want to do is pay attention to our stitch counts. Our stitch counts will be the thing that will keep us on track always. And for me, when I am working with chains, what I like to do is use split ring stitch markers, but you can use anything. You can use like a hairpin, a locking stitch marker, or just cut short scraps of yarn and thread it. Use your hook and just pull it through your first and last stitch, just so you know where you're going to be ending. And one other thing I want to touch on when it comes to working into chains, what I usually do is when I'm working into a turning chain, I like to work under the top 2 loops. So when I'm putting my stitch marker in, I slide it under the top 2 loops like that, so that when I come across my row, I know I'm working under those 2 loops, and that is going to be my last stitch. But that is this is what helped me as I was starting out. It was to always mark my first and last stitch on every row. It can get a little bit tedious because you have to stop, take the stitch marker out, work your stitch, and replace the stitch marker. But trust me, until you get to the point where you can just look at something and sort of figure out where you went wrong, always mark your first and last stitch. It'll keep you on track so you don't miss any stitches and help you to kind of keep everything lining up nicely. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to use turning chains if you still want to do that. And then I'm going to give you my favorite alternative to a turning chain. So I'm going to continue using my little swatch here, and I'm going to start. So I'm using double crochets. So when you're using turning chains, the general rule is this: if you're working a single crochet, you're going to chain one, but you're never going to work into that chain one. You're always going to work into your actual stitches. So the first row I'm going to do is I'm going to do a row of single crochet, then I'll show you how to do a row of half double crochet, and then a row of double crochet using turning chains. So for a single crochet, I would chain one, and then I would take my stitch marker out, and I'm going to place a single crochet in the very first stitch. So you would just insert your hook and work a single crochet, and then you would work a single crochet all the way across your row until you get to the end, and then you would just work into your last stitch and turn. And you wouldn't work into your turning chains when you're working with single crochet. Normally in most crochet projects, you don't end up working into a chain one unless you're working with slip stitches. That's the only place I've ever seen a chain one counting as a stitch, is if you're working rows of slip stitches. And even then, I don't use the chain one. I just, without chaining, just work a slip stitch in my first and last stitch. That's just how I do it. And now I've gotten to the end of my row. I'm going to take my stitch marker out. I'm going to go under the top two loops of the turning chain because I'm working into double crochets. If this was a single crochet down here, I wouldn't be working into the turning chain. But just because I'm using the same swatch, I have to work into that last stitch so I don't lose a stitch. So now we have a row of single crochet, and I'll do one more row just so I can come back to this chain one, that turning chain, just so you can kind of see what it looks like when I work into that last single crochet over here and then not work into the chain one. So again, if you're working single crochet, you're going to chain one, you're going to turn, and you're going to single crochet into your first stitch. You're not going to skip the stitch, and you're going to work all the way across your row. And then when you get to the end of your row, you're not going to be working into the chain one. And now we get to the end. And when you get to the end of a row that is single crochet, you're going to have your last stitch here, and then your turning chain on the side. It usually just looks like a little knot. You're not going to work into that. You're just going to work into your last stitch. And then you're going to see your little turning chain on the end there. You're not going to go into that. Your row is complete. And then you just continue working like that if you're working single crochet. If you're working half double crochets and you want to use a turning chain, your turning chain would be 2 chains. So if you were going to work a half double crochet, you'd go 1, 2, turn your work, and now you would not be working into this first stitch because these 2 chains count as your first stitch. And when you're working patterns or tutorials, pay close attention to whether they're stating if the chain 2 at the beginning of the row counts as a stitch. If they say the chain 2 counts as a stitch, then you would chain 2, skip this first stitch, and then you're working into the following stitch. So you would yarn over, skip that stitch, and work into the following stitch. If it says the chain 2 does not count as a stitch, you're going to work into your first stitch. So if the chain 2 counts as a stitch, skip the first stitch and work into the next stitch. If the chain 2 does not count as a stitch, you must work into the first stitch. So I'm going to go ahead and work across this row here. Now I'm at the end of the row. I'm now going to chain 2, turn, and I'm going to work back across the other way and then show you how I would work into the top of the chain 2. Now for me, when I do half double crochets, I only chain 1. Even if I'm working with a pattern that says the chain 2 counts as a stitch, I omit 1 chain, I only chain 1, and then I work into each stitch. So, but for the purpose of this section of the video, I just chain 2. I'm going to skip this stitch and I'm going to work across, and then I'll come back and show you how I work into the top of the chain 2. Okay, so now I'm at the end of the row and I need to work into the top of the chain 2. What I like to work under the top 2 loops of the chain. So usually in order to do that, you're going to have to sort of turn it towards you like that. So I have 1 chain and 2, and now that I turn it towards me, I see that I haven't worked into this stitch here. So I could have easily missed that little stitch there. So I do that. And then now I have my 2 chains that I need to work into. And a lot of times it's hard to get under the top 2 loops. So what I like to do is I will yarn over and I will take my hook like this and just slide it under that bottom loop there that I can see from this side. It is very finicky, but it's helpful. And then I will pull it through, but then I have to stick my hook in. Just so now you can see the top 2 loops of that stitch, and then I'll yarn over and pull through and then finish off my half double crochet. Because then what that also does, it'll just help to hold the stitch straight up, rather than if you kind of worked into just 1 loop, it would have been a little bit looser. So that's how I work half double crochets if I'm using a turning chain. Now I'm going to show you how to work into your turning chains when you're doing double crochets, and then I'll move on to showing you some alternatives to using turning chains. So for double crochets, you're going to be chaining 3 at the beginning of your row. So you would go 1, 2, 3, turn your work, and if these 3 chains are going to count as a stitch, you're going to skip this first stitch and your next double crochet will be in the following stitch. So you could just go like that. And then, as I said, you can just use your stitch marker. Just put it under the top chain of your chain 3 so that you won't ever miss that stitch to work into. So now I'm just going to work across the row, and then I'm going to show you how I work into the top of this chain 2 from the row below. Okay, so I've worked across my row, and now I just have my little chain 2 here that I need to work into. So I'm going to yarn over, and I'm going to use my hook to grab onto that bottom bump of the chain so I can get my hook in there, because it's very tricky also to work into turning chains. And then I go under, oh, and I missed one, see? All right, there we go. So now I'm under, yarn over, pull through 2, pull through 2. And then I've finished that row of double crochet. So that's pretty much how you would work if you're going to be using turning chains. If single crochet, you're going to chain 1, you won't skip any stitches, you're going to work into each stitch all the way across. When it comes to single crochet, you don't usually work into your turning chain. When you're doing half double crochet, if you're using turning chains, you're going to be chaining 2 at the beginning of your row. You're going to be skipping your first stitch, working across, but then once you get to the end of the row, you always have to be sure that you're working into the top of the turning chain from the previous row, just so you don't miss any stitches. And as I said, use stitch markers to mark your first and last stitch so you don't miss them. And then when you're working double crochets, you would chain 3 at the beginning of your row. You're going to be skipping the first stitch, working across, and then working into the top of the chain 3 from the previous row. And that's just how you're going to do it. Just make sure you're using your stitch markers to mark your first and last stitch so you don't miss any stitches. Now, if you're working taller stitches, say you're working trebles or double trebles, for treble, you would chain 4 at the beginning, and it just, as the stitches get higher, you would just add 1 more chain. So single crochet, chain 1, half double crochet, chain 2, double crochet, 3, treble, 4, and so on and so forth. As the stitches get higher, you just add one more chain. So now I'm going to show you the alternative that I use to turning chains. And I don't use this on all stitches. I usually use it on the taller stitches, double crochets, treble, and so on. For single and half double, I just chain one at the beginning of my rows and then work my rows, and that usually keeps my edges nice and straight. So what I usually use at the beginning of my rows when I'm working double crochets, treble crochets, double trebles, I used what is called a stacked single crochet. And I'm going to show you how to do that right now. So in order to work a stacked single crochet, you're not going to be using any chains at all. When you get to the end of your row, you're going to turn your work, and without chaining, you're going to insert your hook into your first stitch. You're going to yarn over, pull up a loop, and then yarn over, pull through both loops on your hook. And now you have a single crochet that's sort of tilted sideways. Now what you're going to do, you're going to take your hook and you're going to insert under these two loops right here. So if you turn it, so this is what it looks like when you're looking at it with the project facing you. Now what you want to do is turn it sideways so you can get under this loop and the one right behind it. So like that one, and then the other one. So now you've gone under two loops. You're going to yarn over, pull up a loop, and then yarn over, pull through both loops. And now you have a stacked single crochet. And then for the rest of the row, you're just going to work your double crochet stitches like you normally would until you get to the end of your row. And the good thing is it looks a lot more similar to your actual stitches, so it keeps everything nice and uniform. So I'm gonna get to the end of the row and I'm gonna show you how to do it once more. All right, so I'm at the end of my row and I'm gonna show you how to do the stacked single crochet again. So when you get to the end of your row, do not chain. Just insert your hook directly into your first stitch, yarn over and pull up a loop, and then yarn over, pull through both loops on your hook, and then you're going to insert your hook under this loop here and the loop right behind it. So then you should pick up two loops, 1, 2, yarn over, pull up a loop, and then yarn over, pull through both loops on your hook, and then continue working your double crochet stitches as normal. And if you were doing a taller stitch, similar to the turning chain, you would just add one more single crochet. So let me back it out just a little bit. So here I have two. If I were working a treble, I would go under once more. So under those two, yarn over, pull up a loop until I have 3. Double treble, you would go one more. Under those two, yarn over, pull up until you have 4. So you're just working stacked single crochets until you get to the height of the stitch you're working. So that's what you're going to do. You would just keep stacking the single crochet on top of each other until your stacked single crochet matches the height of the stitch that is coming next. So that's pretty much how you do it. And this is what I use every single time I'm working double crochets or anything taller. I just usually use a stacked single crochet. I don't use a turning chain. Okay, so I'm gonna just quickly work a couple of rows of double crochet just so I can show you how to work into the top of the stacked single crochet. So I'm gonna quickly work those rows and come right back. So now I'm at the end of the row where I would have to work into the top of the stacked single crochet. And all you want to do is just slightly tilt your work forward just so you can see those top 2 loops, because the top of it will look like an actual stitch, but a lot of times you have to tilt it towards you because it tilts toward the front of the work. So just yarn over, tilt it so you can see the top 2 loops, insert your hook under those loops, yarn over, pull up a loop, and complete your stitch like you usually would. And that's how you use the stacked single crochet. I'm going to walk you through how it looks on a complete swatch, and then we'll go through some final things. So this one is double crochet, and all along the sides, I didn't use turning chains. I used the stacked single crochet. And then I will show you this one is a half double crochet. And for the half double crochet, as I said, at the beginning and end of the row, I just chain 1 and then work into the first stitch. I don't chain 2. But one thing to look out for when you're doing your half double crochets like this is your stitches tend to tilt away from you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually work a row. I'm going to quickly work a row of half double crochet, and then I'll show you what it looks like so you don't miss your last stitch of the row, because it's very easy to miss when you only chain one with the half double crochet. The stitch tilts away, so it's just something to look out for. So I'm going to quickly work a couple rows of half double crochet, and then I'm going to show you what I mean. Okay, so I've worked a couple rows of half double crochet, and this is what will happen when you chain one at the beginning of your rows with half double crochet. Your stitch is going to tilt toward the front of your work. So like this row where I'm at the end of the row, what I usually have to do is, this is what the last stitch is going to look like. So if you're not paying close attention, you could miss it. So what you want to do is tilt your work towards you so you can see the top two loops that you're working under. Because we know for the half double crochet, we have 3 loops. So that's 1, 2, and then this one that goes across here is 3. So you just want to tilt your work towards you, yarn over, and insert under the top 2 loops so you don't miss that last stitch. And I'll say again, use your stitch markers to mark your first and last stitch. That way you won't drop or add any stitches to the beginning or ends of your rows. That is it for today's video. I really hope you found it helpful. If you did, please give me a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel. Also, share the video with someone that you think it would help. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, take care and bye for now.